Hello everyone, and welcome to my YNR Official 24 channel. Take this USB and defeat him. Was not a plea but a command that echoed through the dimly lit study where Victor Newman stood alone, the weight of decades of secrets pressing against his chest like a vice, when the door creaked open without warning and a figure stepped out of the shadows, a young woman with eyes too familiar to ignore, eyes that carried the same fire Victor once saw in Matt's gaze years ago before betrayal, blood, and lies tore everything apart. And as Victor turned slowly, his instinct sharpened by a lifetime of enemies, the woman spoke not with fear but with certainty, announcing herself not by name but by presence, by legacy, by truth incarnate, and when she finally spoke again, her voice steady yet trembling beneath layers of restrained fury, she said the three words that would fracture Victor's world beyond repair: "I am proof." And in that instant Victor understood that this was not just Matt's daughter standing before him but the embodiment of every sin he had buried, every life he had manipulated, every truth he had rewritten to maintain his empire, because proof was the one thing Victor Newman feared more than death, more than prison, more than losing power. Proof meant exposure, and exposure meant the collapse of the myth he had spent his entire life constructing, and before Victor could respond, before his legendary composure could reassert itself, the woman stepped closer and pressed a small, black USB drive into his palm, curling his fingers around it with deliberate force as she whispered, "Take this USB and defeat him," and Victor flinched not at the command but at the implication, because him was not an enemy in the traditional sense but the monster Victor himself had created, the darker reflection that had grown unchecked in the shadows of his ambition, the version of Victor that believed morality was weakness and love was leverage. And as the woman withdrew her hand she began to speak again, unleashing a torrent of truth that had been simmering for 27 years, revealing how she had grown up under a false name, how her mother had died protecting evidence meant to expose Victor's crimes, how Matt had been silenced not because he was disloyal but because he refused to become Victor, how the USB contained recordings, financial ledgers, medical reports, falsified death certificates, and one final video confession Victor himself had unknowingly recorded during a drunken night when guilt cracked his armor and he spoke freely, believing no one would ever hear it, and Victor staggered backward as her words hit him like blows, each sentence stripping away another layer of control until he was no longer the titan of industry but a man cornered by his own past. And still she continued, explaining how she had waited, watched, studied Victor from afar, learning his patterns, his weaknesses, how he pitted his children against one another, how he justified cruelty as protection, how he destroyed anyone who threatened the illusion of his righteousness, and yet despite all of it she stood there not seeking revenge but justice, because Matt had taught her that truth was a weapon sharper than hatred, and the USB was not meant to destroy Victor but to force him into a reckoning, to choose whether he would finally defeat the monster within or let it consume everything he had left, and Victor found himself unable to speak, memories flooding his mind unbidden. Matt laughing in the warehouse before everything went wrong, promises made and broken, blood on concrete floors, orders given with a nod and averted eyes, and for the first time in his life Victor Newman felt small, because the girl before him did not beg, did not threaten, did not scream, she simply stood in unyielding silence after delivering her truth, allowing Victor to sit with the unbearable weight of it, and when he finally found his voice it cracked. A sound so unfamiliar it startled him more than any accusation, and he asked her what she wanted, expecting money, power, retribution, but she shook her head slowly and said she wanted the truth released when Victor was ready to face it, not when he was forced, because if the truth came out without his choice it would destroy everyone, but if he chose to expose himself, to confess, to dismantle the empire he built on lies, then maybe something better could rise from the ruins. And Victor laughed bitterly at that, a hollow sound that carried no triumph, because he knew redemption was not something he had earned, and yet as he looked at Matt's daughter he saw not condemnation but resolve, and that terrified him more than hatred ever could, because hatred could be fought, but resolve rooted in truth was unstoppable, and as she turned to leave she paused at the door and delivered her final blow, reminding Victor that the USB was encrypted to his biometric signature, that only he could unlock it, that the choice was his alone, and with that she disappeared into the night, leaving Victor standing in the silence with the weight of three words echoing in his mind: "I am proof," Words that dismantled decades of denial and forced Victor to confront the simple, devastating reality that no empire survives the truth forever. And as the study lights flickered and Victor sank into his chair, the USB heavy in his hand, he realized that defeating him meant destroying the man he had been to become something else, something unknown, and for the first time since he clawed his way out of nothingness, Victor Newman was afraid not of losing everything but of finally seeing himself clearly, because proof had arrived, and proof does not negotiate, it waits. And somewhere in the darkness the legacy of Matt lived on, not as a ghost seeking vengeance but as a daughter who delivered justice in 3 words and walked away, knowing the battle was no longer hers to fight. Continued to reverberate through Victor's mind long after the door closed behind Matt's daughter, the soundless echo louder than any shout, and as the night deepened around the Newman estate, Victor remained frozen in his chair, the USB drive resting in his palm like a loaded weapon, its smooth surface deceptively innocent compared to the devastation it promised, and for hours he did nothing but stare at it, memories unfurling with merciless clarity, because once proof exists, denial becomes impossible, and Victor knew with chilling certainty that the girl had not exaggerated, had not fabricated, had not manipulated, for she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had already survived the worst, and slowly, almost against his will, Victor began to recall the small, seemingly insignificant moments he had dismissed years ago, the unsigned reports, the vanished witnesses, the files he had ordered destroyed but never personally confirmed, the night he drank too much and spoke too freely to a recorder he believed inactive, and the realization struck him like a blade that he himself had left the door open for this reckoning, and as dawn crept through the tall windows, Victor rose unsteadily and moved to his desk, placing the USB beside framed photographs of his family, each smiling face now seeming accusatory, as if asking whether they too were merely props in the grand narrative he had constructed to justify his actions, and when Victor finally pressed his thumb against the biometric scanner embedded in the drive, he hesitated, because once unlocked there would be no returning to ignorance, and ignorance had been his most reliable shield, but proof does not wait forever, and with a grim resolve he pressed down, the device lighting up softly as files began to populate the screen. And what followed was a descent into a past Victor had rewritten so many times he almost believed his own lies, recordings of phone calls ordering containment, financial trails leading to offshore accounts used to silence families, medical reports altered to declare deaths accidental when they were anything but, and then the final file, labeled simply Matt, and Victor's breath caught as the video began to play, revealing his younger self, raw and unguarded, speaking into the darkness about fear, regret, and the necessity of eliminating threats before they destroyed everything he had built, and hearing his own voice stripped of bravado and coded in cowardice shattered something inside him, because this was not the strategic genius he told himself he was but a frightened man choosing cruelty over courage, and as the video ended Victor slammed the laptop shut, the room echoing with the sound, yet even that violent act could not silence the truth now roaring through his veins, and in that moment Victor understood the brilliance of Matt's daughter's ultimatum. Because she had not come to destroy him directly, she had come to make him destroy himself, and defeat him, the monster within, on his own terms, or live forever knowing he had refused to face the truth when it stood before him, and as the day unfolded Victor summoned no one, called no lawyers, issued no orders, instead he wandered the halls of his own home like a ghost, overhearing fragments of conversations from staff, seeing reflections of himself in mirrors he no longer recognized. And when Nikki's laughter floated in from another room, it felt like a blade twisting deeper, because how many times had he justified betrayal as protection, how many times had he convinced himself that love meant control, and now control was the one thing slipping beyond his grasp, and by nightfall Victor made his first choice not as a king defending his throne but as a man confronting his sins. He encrypted copies of the files, prepared a contingency release should anything happen to him, and then he did something unimaginable. He began to write a confession, not the sanitized corporate statement he had perfected over decades, but a raw account of his actions, his motivations, his failures, and as the words poured out they burned, because truth hurts most when spoken honestly, and when the confession was complete Victor stared at it for a long time before saving it under a single title, Defeating Him, and the next morning he requested meetings with those he had wronged, not to negotiate silence but to offer the truth, and some slammed doors in his face, some laughed bitterly, some wept, and each reaction stripped away another layer of the armor he had worn for so long, and news began to leak, not explosively, but deliberately, controlled yet undeniable, as Victor ensured the narrative was no longer about power but accountability, and the press erupted, shareholders panicked, enemies circled like vultures, yet Victor felt an unexpected calm, because for the first time the battlefield was honest, and somewhere beyond the chaos Matt's daughter watched. From a distance, reading headlines, monitoring reactions, waiting not for Victor's downfall but for proof of change, and when Victor finally sought her out again it was not to bargain but to acknowledge, meeting her in a quiet public place with no guards, no intimidation, only the weight of their shared history between them, and he told her he had begun the process she demanded, that he had released the truth, that he was dismantling the structures built on lies, and she listened without interruption, her expression unreadable, until he finished and fell silent, and then she spoke again, not with anger but with measured resolve, telling him that defeating him was not a single act but a lifelong reckoning, that redemption was not guaranteed, only responsibility, and Victor nodded, accepting a verdict harsher than punishment, because it offered no absolution, only awareness. And as they parted Victor felt something unfamiliar yet genuine settle in his chest, not relief, not triumph, but the quiet understanding that power without truth is hollow, and that proof, once spoken, reshapes everything it touches, and though the world would debate whether Victor Newman deserved forgiveness, whether his confession was too little too late, one fact remained unshakable: Matt's legacy had not been buried. It had risen through his daughter in 3 words that shattered an empire and forced a titan to confront the man he truly was, and whether Victor survived that truth was no longer the question, because the real victory belonged to proof itself, unyielding, patient, and finally seen. No longer felt like an order spoken in anger but like a sentence handed down by fate itself, and as the days turned into weeks the consequences of Victor's choice rippled outward in ways even he could not fully predict, because truth, once released, does not move in straight lines but fractures into countless narratives, each shaped by the fears, hopes, and agendas of those who receive it. And Victor watched as his empire began to tremble not from a single catastrophic collapse but from a slow, relentless unraveling, board members resigning, investigations opening, allies distancing themselves with carefully worded statements, while enemies who had once cowered now spoke boldly, yet through all of it Victor remained strangely present, refusing to retreat into legal fortresses or public silence, appearing instead before cameras with a gravity that startled even his harshest critics. Admitting wrongdoing without excuses, acknowledging names rather than hiding behind abstractions, and every time he spoke he felt the weight of Matt's daughter's 3 words pressing against his spine like an invisible hand keeping him upright. I am proof, because proof had become his compass, guiding each decision no matter how painful, and the more Victor confronted the damage he had caused, the clearer it became that defeating him was not about dismantling corporations or surviving scandal but about confronting the instinct that had driven him to see people as assets and threats instead of lives, and this realization haunted him most in quiet moments, when he sat alone and remembered the children he had manipulated, the lovers he had betrayed, the partners he had sacrificed, and he began to understand that Matt had not been his greatest enemy but his final warning, the man who saw what Victor was becoming and dared to stand in his way. And now that warning lived on through a daughter who refused to let the truth die, and as the legal proceedings intensified Victor made another choice that stunned everyone. He declined certain defenses offered by his attorneys, allowing evidence to stand that could have been buried through technicalities, because burying the truth again would be the ultimate betrayal of the reckoning he had begun, and the courtroom became a theater of consequences, where witnesses spoke of fear and loss, where documents from the USB surfaced publicly, where Victor sat in silence absorbing each testimony like penance, and outside the courthouse crowds gathered, some demanding justice, others expressing reluctant respect, and still others insisting that no confession could erase decades of harm, and Victor accepted all of it without protest, because he had finally learned that accountability does not negotiate with comfort, and yet amid the chaos something unexpected began to form, not forgiveness, but curiosity. As people started to ask why a man with so much power would choose exposure over survival, and journalists began tracing the origin of the USB, uncovering fragments of Matt's story, speculating about the mysterious daughter who had catalyzed everything, and Victor, honoring her wish, never spoke her name, protecting her anonymity as fiercely as he once protected his secrets, because some truths deserved guardianship rather than spectacle, and in private moments Victor wrote letters he never sent, to Matt, to his younger self, to the daughter who forced his awakening, each letter an attempt to articulate the remorse that words could never fully capture, and sometimes he wondered whether this path would lead to redemption or simply to a different kind of ruin, but he walked it regardless, because walking away would mean surrendering to the very man he was trying to defeat, and as months passed the empire he built transformed into something leaner, less powerful, stripped of its darkest mechanisms, and while some accused Victor of orchestrating a long con, others saw consistency in his actions, a sustained commitment to transparency that could not be easily faked, and through it all Matt's daughter remained watchful, her life continuing quietly beyond the spotlight, working with advocacy groups, supporting others whose truths had been silenced, and every so often she received updates about Victor's progress, not from him directly but through the consequences unfolding in the world, and she measured him not by apologies but by patterns, by whether his actions aligned with the truth even when no one was watching, and one evening, long after the headlines had softened, Victor found himself standing alone at a modest grave marked with Matt's name, the air heavy with unsaid words, and he spoke aloud for the first time, not to seek forgiveness but to acknowledge debt, admitting that fear had guided him more than strength, that control had masqueraded as leadership, and that it took Matt's daughter, proof incarnate, to end the cycle he could not stop on his own, and though no answer came, Victor felt something settle within him, not peace but clarity, and clarity, he realized, was enough to keep moving forward, and as he walked away he understood that defeating him was not a victory to be celebrated but a vigilance to be maintained, because the monster he had been did not vanish, it waited, patient and persuasive, ready to return if given the slightest justification, and so Victor chose vigilance, chose humility, chose to live under the shadow of proof rather than above it. And in doing so he altered not just his own fate but the narrative of power itself, demonstrating that even titans could be brought to reckon with their truths when confronted by courage untainted by vengeance, and somewhere in that altered landscape Matt's daughter continued her life, knowing that her 3 words had done what armies and lawsuits never could, they had forced a man to see himself, and once seen, he could never again claim ignorance, because proof had spoken, and its echo would endure long after empires rose and fell. Remained the silent thesis of Victor's altered life, and in the quieter years that followed, when courtrooms emptied and headlines faded, the true measure of that command revealed itself not in public reckonings but in the daily discipline of restraint, because Victor learned that the hardest battles are fought when no one is watching, when old instincts whisper that control is efficiency and fear is respect. And each time those voices rose he remembered the weight of the USB in his hand and the calm certainty in Matt's daughter's eyes, reminders that power without truth corrodes from within, and so Victor chose differently, stepping back where he once would have dominated, listening where he once would have commanded, accepting limitations as safeguards rather than insults, and though the world never fully forgave him, it no longer needed to, because forgiveness was never the goal, responsibility was. And responsibility demanded consistency, and sometimes, in rare reflective moments, Victor acknowledged that the 3 words, "I am proof," had not only exposed his past but redefined his future, transforming proof from an enemy into a compass, and as years passed he became less concerned with how history would judge him and more focused on ensuring that the structures he left behind could not replicate the harm he once justified, understanding at last that defeating him was not an ending but a promise renewed every day, a promise born the moment Matt's daughter appeared, placed the truth in his hand, and walked away knowing that the most powerful weapon she could offer was not destruction, but undeniable proof.